Good morning, welcome back. Today is May 22nd, and before we get back into talking about Luke, and today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 15, three very well-known passages. Let's talk about a few of the things that happened on this date. Well, first of all, it was on this date in 399 AD that Constantine the Great died. Constantine the Great. Now, he is the guy that made Christianity legal. Okay, he did not make Christianity the religion of Rome, but he made it legal. And then the next, one of the later Roman emperors made it the state religion. But Constantine is often given credit for that. He certainly put the ball in motion for that. And some people have looked on that as a great time. Others have looked at it as not so much. And I think that's kind of an interesting discussion, what effect Constantine's actions had on the long-term success of Christianity. Maybe my next class will talk about that. In 1807, a man named Trounsyn Speakman sold the first fruit-flavored carbonated drink in Philadelphia. That would be fruit-flavored pop, as we call it, or soda, depending on where you live. But the first time that was sold was in Philadelphia on this date in 1807. In 1954, a young Robert Zimmerman was bar mitzvahed. Here's a picture of him when he was 15. Some of you may not know who that is, but you may recognize him better by this picture and by his more common name, Bob Dylan. That's right, he's Jewish. So Mr. Dylan was bar mitzvahed on this date in 1954. In 1962, baseball player and Yankee great Roger Maris was walked 5 times in a single game. 4 times he was walked intentionally. Now keep in mind, 1962 was the year after Roger Maris had hit 61 home runs. And so they were, of course, pitchers were a little hesitant to pitch to him. Not to be outdone, in 1990, Andre Dawson, Cub great, Montreal Expo great Andre Dawson, got 5 intentional walks on a single day, on this date. Okay, so 5 intentional walks in a single day. And in 1992, some of you may remember this day because today was the final appearance of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. That was it. It ended today, his 29-year reign as the king of late-night TV. I know where I was there. 2 other things. It was on this date in 1859 that Arthur Conan Doyle was born. Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of many books, including the Sherlock Holmes stories. But he did write several other adventure kind of stories as well, but Sherlock Holmes was surely and clearly his best known. And finally, it was on this date in 1690 that Johann Schutz died. Now, Johann Schutz was a German lawyer, a Lutheran, and a hymn writer. His best known hymn is the hymn Sing Praise to God who reigns above, the God of all creation, the God of power, the God of love. Again, I would sing it for you, but I want you to stick with me for the rest of our time together. Okay, so we're going to talk about Luke chapter 15 today, about the 3 parables that deal with being lost and found. So let's get back to talking about that. Good morning, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 15, which is arguably the most well-known chapter in the book of Luke. If it's not the most well-known, it's tied for the Christmas story in Luke chapter 2. And if it weren't for the Charlie Brown Christmas special, Luke chapter 15 would probably be the best-known chapter in all of the Gospel of Luke. And it's it's so well-known because it has probably the best-known story that Jesus told, and that is a story of what is commonly referred to as the prodigal son. And we're going to talk about that as we get along here in Luke chapter 15. But in order to kind of get it, and again, I really want to, on the one hand, I don't want to get lost in the details, and on the other, but I want to keep in focus with where Luke is in terms of what he's presenting and who Jesus is talking to, and kind of present a point of view as far as what this particular passage is talking about. Okay, so remember when we talked last week, we were in Luke chapter 14, of course, and we ended up, Jesus had gone to a banquet and he had talked to, several people and all of that. And then after the banquet, it said large crowds, this is in the end of 14 verse 25, large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Okay. So again, he had large crowds with him. All right. So he'd been at a banquet. Now large crowds are traveling with Jesus. And there's a reaction to that crowd following Jesus. So the start of chapter 15 is a reaction on the part of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law to the to these crowds. And then Jesus tells three parables in reaction to the crowd. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind as we look at Luke chapter 15 and the three stories that are included there, that these are in reaction to the Pharisees' reaction to the crowd. Okay, so as far as when we start looking at what is Jesus making a point about, we have to think about, okay, who is he talking to and why was he talking to them? What is the context of that? Okay. Because really, it's interesting that the stories are not resolved, especially the last one, is not resolved as cleanly as you'd think, as many of the sermons that you may have heard over the course of your lifetime may have led you to believe. But this sermon, that the stories are not resolved all that neatly. Okay, so again, in chapter 15, beginning with verse 1, Jesus is. Luke is talking. He says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus." Now this is interesting because again, in verse 25, chapter 14, verse 25, it said large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Okay, and then turning to them, he said, and then he talks to them. Okay, so amongst these crowds, we see large tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around. Okay, but so amongst these are these tax collectors and sinners, amongst this crowd. And we know that because this is what the Pharisees say in verse 2. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Okay. Now I've mentioned it before, but having dinner with a person within the Jewish context had a much more significant meaning than perhaps it does today. Or that was where you really fellowship with somebody. Okay, so again, you showed agreement by sitting down and having a meal with somebody. Whereas in the U.S., Western Christianity, we show agreement by shaking hands. There, you would show agreement by sitting down and having a meal, sharing bread with someone. Okay, and this is kind of getting into why the Lord's Supper is so significant. Okay, because it is an element of relationship, an element of fellowship, more significant to the Jewish context than it is to the U.S. Western context. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the Last Supper. But so Jesus is teaching. Okay, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Okay, so Pharisees, teachers of the law. And again, I mentioned this before, teachers of the law, these are like the Bible scholars. Okay, these are the theologians of the day. And the Pharisees, and here's something I want to mention here, and I may not have made this clear in the past, but in this time period, to be a Pharisee, okay, to say that I am a Pharisee, was not necessarily a job description. Now there are clearly people, there were clearly persons who made their living off of being a Pharisee, but it wasn't necessarily a job. Okay, it was and we said that the political or that the Pharisees were the conservatives. They were the political supporters of a nationalist Israel, and so. To be a Pharisee had as much to do with having a particular political religious outlook as it did with what you did for a living. Okay, it was not exactly the same thing, but it was not Unlike nowadays, if you say, I am a Democrat, or I am a Republican, or I am a Libertarian, I'm a Green Party, whatever political party you whatever political party you happen to be a part of. Okay, if you say, I am a Republican or I am a Democrat, that doesn't necessarily identify what you do for a living. Okay, so here in the first idea or in the first parable that Jesus is going to talk about, he's going to be talking to a group of Pharisees, and he's going to suggest to them that they are in the business of owning sheep, okay, or that they have some understanding of owning sheep. So you could do that as a Pharisee. You could be a sheep owner and be a Pharisee, okay? You could be an innkeeper and be a Pharisee. You could be a religious leader, of course, and be a Pharisee. You could be a tent maker and be a Pharisee, okay? So again, it wasn't, again, like I said, there were some who clearly made their living out of being Pharisees, just like there are some today who make their living out of being members of political parties. Okay, there are professional Republicans, there are professional Democrats, there are professional Libertarians, whatever. Okay, so keep that in mind, and that kind of explains why, you know, as we get into why the first parable, etc., has resonance, because these guys could have been, maybe one of them, maybe Jesus knew that one of them was a sheep owner. Okay, but that's something, something that we tend to think about. We tend to think of the Pharisees. We tend to think of the Pharisees as the bad guys, when in fact they weren't. They were the good guys from an Israelite point of view. But we tend to think of them as the bad guys, and we tend to think of them as this group of guys who did nothing but study the Bible all day, or study the Torah all day. And that's not true. They usually, or I should say very often, had occupations, like tent maker, Paul the tent maker. Okay, so that wasn't that unusual. Okay, so but these Pharisees, and that's why they're all around. That's why they can afford dinners. This is why later on Jesus is going to talk about, or somewhere in Luke, Jesus says, or Luke condemns the Pharisees and saying, well, they love money. Well, yeah, they're in business. They're businessmen. Okay, so keep that in mind. Thought about the Pharisees when you see them and what they do. Okay, so crowds are following Jesus. These Pharisees and teachers of the law are looking at him going, well, yeah, this guy they're just sinners following him. If he truly was a rabbi, if he truly was a believer like us, then he wouldn't have anything to do with him. This is kind of the speculation on my part. Okay, so Jesus replies to them with three parables. Okay, three very well-known parables. And let's talk about each of them. Then Jesus told them this parable. Now I'm going to read through the parable itself, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it a little bit, okay? Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Okay. All right. Interesting. Okay. Suppose one of you. Now, again, this is not unusual. Maybe there were landowners. Maybe there were livestock owners in this midst. Okay. So they would have gotten this idea. All right. Now, the main character of this particular parable is the sheep owner. Okay. It's the sheep owner. And it says here, and so suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Now let's give a shout out to the sheep of the world. Okay, at this point, usually in a lot of the messages you have heard, there's always a rabbit trail, where the preacher, pastor, teacher talks about how stupid sheep are. Okay, now sheep may not be the smartest animals in the drawer. Okay, I'm not arguing that. Okay, but the point here is not whether or not sheep are smart. Okay, it doesn't say that the sheep did something wrong, because in fact the sheep did nothing wrong. The sheep just was being a sheep. Okay, the sheep wandered off, or for whatever reason, and the person in charge of the sheep lost one. Okay, so again, it's like, let's lay off the sheep. Let's quit talking about how dumb sheep are. Okay, let's focus on the point that Jesus is trying to make. Okay, so the sheep owner is the one who's lost the sheep. Now, is the sheep owner the shepherd? Perhaps. Okay, so but we don't necessarily want to equate the two. But clearly, if you have 100 sheep, which is a good size, not the biggest size flock, but it's a good size, it's a decent size flock. You have 100 sheep and you lost one. Okay, so suppose there's one. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and you lost one. Now, can you think about that for a second? Okay, so there's some significant counting going on here. Okay, I went on one of the first campouts I went on with my son, my younger son. We went to what was called a resident camp, and in this particular resident camp, there were 3 adults and there were 10 scouts along with. And in this particular camp, it was great fun. I remember it. But I remember having this running joke with one of the other adults that all we did the whole time we were there is say something to the effect of, again, remember 10 scouts? Is to say something along the line of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Who's missing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Who's missing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Who's missing? So you can imagine if you have 100 sheep, and they all, again, I'm not a shepherd, so all sheep look alike to me, and maybe to a shepherd, maybe to somebody who's a sheep owner, they would be able to differentiate between one sheep and another. But even still, if there's 100 of them, it's kind of hard to differentiate. But still, you get to the point where you know there's 99 and you know you're missing one. Okay? Now, maybe it's just that the one that they were missing is that one sheep. Okay? That one sheep that's always causing trouble, the clever sheep, as it were. Okay? That's trying to get away. But it's the sheep owner's fault that the sheep has got away. It's not the sheep's fault. Okay? So let's lay off the sheep. And so Jesus is giving this example to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and say, look, okay, suppose you had 100 sheep and you noticed one missing, that you had lost one. Wouldn't you drop everything and go find that one? Now, here the way the text puts it is that you leave them in the desert, leave 99 in the open country. Now, that in and of itself sounds kind of reckless, but let's not get lost in the details. You've got 99. And you got 99 and one's missing, so let's leave all 99 exposed. I mean, I don't know. I mean, is there a dog? Is there a sheepdog? Is there another shepherd? I don't know. Whatever. The point is, even that 1% is significant enough to the sheep owner that he goes off, and I'm assuming it's a he. It could have been a she. That he or she goes off to try and find that one. Okay. And the listeners would have understood that. The listeners would not have argued with that. The listeners would not have gone, well, wait a minute, what's the deal? You got 99, isn't that enough? I mean, come on. You don't want to risk the 99 for the sake of the one. They would have all understood this, and so they get the idea that, okay, yeah, this is a normal thing. So the sheep owner goes out, maybe the shepherd. He goes out, he finds a sheep. Okay, and when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Okay, so he picks the sheep up and he puts it over his shoulders. Now that suggests a couple of things. That suggests that this sheep is gone quite some ways. It's not a question of just kind of guiding it back and saying, okay, come on, let's go, sheep, walk. I mean, you got to pick the thing up and carry it. Okay, it also suggests that the sheep is not that big. Okay, because if it was like I've seen some big pictures, I've been at a couple fairs. I'm not an agrarian person at all. I'm not a farmer person at all. I mean, I've been at fairs where I've seen some pretty big sheep. I've seen some pictures of pretty big sheep, full-grown sheep, and they're not the kind that you're going to just throw over your shoulder and carry back. So that suggests that this sheep is a little small. But again, I'm speculating. I'm getting lost in the details. The point is, the sheep owner finds a sheep. He puts it on his shoulders. He brings it back. All 100 are back, and he lets all his friends know. Okay, in verse, where is this here? Verse 6. And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. Okay? Rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep. Okay? Now, this could suggest that, hey, let's have a party. Let's rejoice. You know, I found my lost sheep. That's a possibility. It could just be, hey, great news, I found my sheep, yay, kind of thing, you know. And it's just that I can't really imagine that the financial benefit of gaining a sheep back is worth the expense of throwing a party for all your friends. That's where I kind of have a problem with the idea that, hey, he had a party. Now, there are some commentators that look at this and go, oh, yeah, he has a party. It's like, well, yeah, but there's a financial, why would you go to the trouble of saving the sheep and then spend all the money that you got by saving the sheep on a party to rescue the, you know, I don't know. The text doesn't necessarily demand that a party is had. It's just that he calls everybody, goes, and so maybe this suggests that he had told everybody, hey, have you seen my sheep? Have you seen my sheep? Have you seen my sheep? You know, and so he gets everybody together and says, listen, I found my sheep, great, yay, okay. And then Luke adds, and I rephrase that. Okay, Luke, the writer, adds a statement here. Now, there is some, and this is a statement in verse 7. I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Okay, now there are some who look at this passage, verse 7, and say, well, that's Luke commenting on Jesus' parable. Okay, now that's not unusual, and certainly a writer can do that. John was very notorious not notorious may not be the right word. John did that quite a bit. So, for example, like John 3:16, to me, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that is John commenting on Jesus' meeting with Nicodemus. To me, I think that's what that is. But here, I think Jesus is just kind of explaining this parable. He's saying, okay, here's what I mean. Here's why this is important. Okay, now let's just stop at that point. You have the Pharisees are upset because Jesus is just hanging with sinners. And Jesus tells this story about a lost person, sinner, being found, being brought back. And Jesus is clearly indicating that my being with a sinner is a process of bringing him or her back. Notice how everyone around the sheep owner celebrates. Okay, so the question, just based on this one particular story, is like, why aren't you celebrating? Why aren't you celebrating with me? Okay, so that's the first parable, the parable of the lost sheep. But again, the central character is the sheep owner. It's not the sheep. Sheep didn't do anything wrong. The sheep just being a sheep. Okay. Central owner is the sheep owner. Now the second one is a little shorter. It's called the parable of the lost coin. Again, I'm going to just read it through and then we're going to talk about it. Verse 8. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Okay? All right. So you got a woman who's got 10 coins. Right? Now, again, the point is not in the details. You know, why does she have 10 coins? Okay, some have looked at this and said, well, this is her dowry. Okay, well, perhaps it is. And it could be. Perhaps it's just 10 silver coins she has in addition to 10 gold coins and 10 brass coins. I don't know. We don't know. It just says she has 10 silver coins and she's lost one. Okay? Maybe it's all she's got to live on. And she knows one is lost. Okay? Now, this is not a situation where, you're looking at the bank book at the end of the month and you think to yourself, where did all the money go? Now this is clearly something where she knows there were 9 here the day before, now there's 10, or there were 10 here the day before, now there's only 9. What happened to one? Okay, and it's clearly lost. Okay, and when she realizes it's lost, she goes through a great effort to find it. Okay, when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. Very similar to what happens in the previous passage with the lost sheep. Okay, does she call a party? Well, perhaps. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. But again, financially, it doesn't make sense to go to a great deal of effort to find a lost coin and then use that coin to spend money to rejoice the fact that you found the lost coin because you're still out the money. Okay, so I think perhaps it's more of a just rejoice, and the emphasis there is that you should be rejoicing. Rejoice with me. This is a cause for rejoicing. Okay, now again, Luke throws a statement at the end. Luke, the writer, throws a statement at the end, and I think it's Jesus' statement himself. He says, "In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Now, very similar to the parable of the lost sheep. That this rejoicing over the finding of something that was lost causes rejoicing in heaven in reaction to the Pharisees who are upset that Jesus is hanging around with those who are sinners, which are, by definition, people who are lost. Okay? So we've got these two parables, parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep. Lost sheep comes first, parable of the lost coin. Okay? So then we roll into verse 11, and that is probably the best known story in Luke, other than perhaps the Christmas story. Okay, and that's Luke chapter 11 through 31, the story that is usually referred to as the story of the prodigal son. Okay, now let me just kind of tell you the story, and that way then I'm going to tell you half the story, then we're going to finish it here, and then we'll read through it. Okay, so there's a son, there's a father who's got two sons, and the younger son comes to the father and says, "Dad, you owe me something in terms of in terms of the inheritance. Can I have it now?" Dad says, "Sure." Son takes it, goes to a far country, wastes all his money, ends up working in a pig farm, and realizes, hey, I could be better off if I was back at my dad. He goes back to his dad. He says, "Dad, sorry about that." His dad says, "Great, welcome back." Okay, now that is like the Stan version of the first half of this story. Now let's just talk about that for a minute here, a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into the other part of this particular story. Okay, so in verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons." Okay, now although as the story goes on, we're clearly indicated this man is wealthy. There's no question about it. But he's not identified as a rich man, because that would be pejorative. And what I mean by that is in Luke, or even at this time, if you say, "Oh, there was a rich man," and anytime in Luke when you see somebody is identified as a rich man, that usually means there's something wrong with this guy, okay, or there's going to be some flaw seen in this guy. So later on, we're going to talk about the rich man and Lazarus. Okay, so the rich man dies and goes into Hades. Okay, so he just says there's a man, even though clearly he's rich, but there's a man who had two sons. The Jewish listener and the Jewish reader would have heard this story of two sons and thought, "Oh yeah, I got it, two sons, because if you start thinking about the story of Israel and families with two sons, it's never good. Okay, you've got Cain and Abel, you've got Jacob and Esau, you've got who else is there? There's several others where there's a two-son story. Okay, and the younger son tends to be favored. Joseph's younger son gets favored over his older son. David and Bathsheba's older son dies in favor of Solomon, their younger son. Okay, and so historically, I shouldn't say historically, but there's all kinds of historical precedent in Jewish history where the younger son takes precedent over the older son. Okay, so when you introduce a story and say, "Okay, here's the guy with two sons," people are going, "Oh yeah, two sons." You got Isaac and Ishmael. So Ishmael's the older, Isaac is the preferred. Okay, and of course, who's the driver of the action here in the first part of this story? Well, it's the younger son. Okay, now as we go through this whole story, again, I haven't repeated it. I can't repeat it because I haven't said it yet. The main person in this story is not the prodigal son. Okay, that is like a mischaracterization of this story. The main character of this story is the father. Okay, and that's what I want to look at when we talk about Luke or this particular parable. Okay, so we're going to focus on the father. Right. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. All right. Now, this is a passage that has been preached on a bazillion times. Okay, and we probably have all heard sermons, dozens of sermons on this particular story. And there are certain trends that people like to take here. Okay, and one of them starts right here, where we like to really dump on the younger son and say, "Oh, this guy is creating such a heinous act." Okay, that may be true. Okay, but it probably isn't. Okay, what the younger son is asking to do is not normal, but it's not unusual. It's not unheard of. Okay, and keep in mind, here's the key element to this whole thing: the father does not have to comply. There's no rule, there's no law that says the father has to comply, and yet the father does. So why does the son even ask this? Because I think he knows the father will comply. Okay, and I'm going to say this because as we get through this, I'm going to be presenting the younger son as not quite the paragon of virtue that he is often seen to be, certainly at the end. Okay, so the younger son, is kind of a manipulator, sort of like Jacob, who manipulated things out of his brother Esau. The younger son realizes, hey, listen, I'm not going to get a lot here. I need to go make my fortune somewhere else. So I'm going to go to dear old dad. Dad's going to say yes, because he says yes to everything I say. And I'm going to ask for my inheritance now. Again, the dad doesn't have to do this, but the dad, in his love for his son, says, all right, I will. That's what you want to do. I'm going to do it. I will give you your inheritance, the financial equivalent of your inheritance. And so clearly this man is rich enough, wealthy enough, that he can split up his inheritance, he can split up his property, I should say, in such a way that it doesn't break him. Okay? So the younger son takes off with the money. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Okay? Now, this phrase, squandered his wealth, kind of has the image of like spreading seeds that just kind of threw his money away. Now, here's an interesting thought here, that, Jesus knew words for sin, and Jesus knew words for transgression and violation of the law, but he doesn't use those here. And so one of the questions you have to ask yourself in terms of interpreting this, and I don't have a clear answer here, is do you look at the younger son and say, okay, the younger son is in sin, or is the younger son just being foolish? Okay. Now there's there's not a clear line between where the one ends and the other begins. But is the son being sinful, or is he just kind of being creative? Is he being manipulative? Is he being foolish? Or is he being sinful? I mean, there are some analysts who have looked at this and said that the son's asking for this is tantamount to his wishing his father dead. Not necessarily. Okay, that's kind of reading into the text. Don't want to go there. Okay, so again, it's not unusual, not unheard of. He goes to a distant country, and in the course of going to this distant country, amongst the foolish things he does is he literally cuts himself off from his whole family. He cuts himself off from his whole country. So for whatever reason, he wants to disassociate himself not only from his family, but from his immediate family, but from his extended family, and certainly from his country/family. Okay, and we know that based on what happens here in a couple of verses. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. Now, no doubt when he had all this money, he had a bunch of friends, or he was able to buy things, but now suddenly there's a famine. Now, again, this is over the course of time. This isn't something that happened, like within a week. Okay, This takes some time. So how long? I don't know, a month, 6 months, a year. Anything I said would be speculating. But again, it's long enough for him to go out to develop a place or develop a spot, waste all his money, and then for a famine to begin. Okay, so we're talking about a couple of agricultural seasons at least. Okay. After that, he spent everything, and there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need because he's got no money and there's a famine going on. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. Okay. Now, pigs were unclean for the Jewish diet. Okay. Now, he's not eating the pigs. So, some have looked at this and said, oh, it was sinful for him to be here. Well, it's probably not bright. Again, is he foolish? Is he sinful? Again, not, the text doesn't demand you come to either conclusion. Okay. But here, he's in this country. Now he's hungry. He's got no friends. He's got no family because no one would give him anything. Did I read that passage? He longed, verse 16, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Okay, so he has cut himself off from any support network. He's cut himself off from his father. He's cut himself off from his immediate family, from his extended family, from his country. There are no Jewish people around him that are going to help him in his time of need. Okay, so this is foolish. Okay, was it sinful? It certainly wasn't bright, but again, certainly foolish. Verse 17, when he came to his senses, amazing what hunger will do to you. But here's the thing, when he came to his senses. Now, there are some that look at this and say, well, this is his repentance. And there are arguments to say that this is the guy repenting. Okay? And I get that. Okay? But that's not the word that Luke uses. Luke doesn't use the clear, simple word for repent. He doesn't say when the boy looked around and saw how bad it was and repented. Okay? He just comes to his senses. He realizes, hey, at some point, you got to look around and you got to go, hey, I got to cut my losses here. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is you can look at this and see that this boy, this son has a come to Jesus moment. He has a moment of clarity where he recognizes his personal sin and he repents. Okay, that is a possibility, but it's not demanded by the text. Okay, what he has here is a change of mind. What he has here is he realizes I need to change my plan. I need to cut my losses. Okay, I need to go back to square one. Okay, and so here's the thing, and this is why I say that, because the way it's phrased, going into the rest, could be simply a guy thinking through a strategy. Okay. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? Okay. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Okay? Again, it's a subtle distinction here, but this is not necessarily what he believes. It could be, but it's not necessarily. This is what he decides he's going to say. Now, does he believe his father is going to agree to him? I think yes, because he asked his father to split his inheritance, which is something his father didn't have to do. And yet his father did it because he loved his son and wanted his son to have the best for him. Okay? Maybe this father was like, this is not going to end well, so here. Okay? But whatever. So the son decides, okay, this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to go back to my dad, and I'm going to say this. And the understanding that what's not in the text, and again, speculation here, but the father is going to go, oh, of course. I mean, if I was kind enough that I gave you the money that I didn't need to give you, I'm certainly going to give you the necessities that you need now. Okay, so he's counting on his father. So the son kind of looks on his father not so much as a father as much as a bank. Okay, and we'll hold that thought because we're going to come back to it in a minute. Okay, so he got up and went to his father. Again, this is sometime later. I think, this is just my opinion, it's at least a year later. Okay, again, because you've got a couple of seasons for a famine has got to set in. Okay, and a famine doesn't usually last after one season, but it's clearly some period of time, several months, a year, maybe 2-3 years. Okay. Middle of verse 20 here. So he went up and got to his father. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Okay. Now, again, a lot has been talked about this. I mean, some have said, well, what's the deal with his running to him? Some have argued that, well, because of the grievous sin that the son had inflicted or committed against the father, the family would have stoned him, and so the father was rushing out there to protect him. Okay, all right. Or some have looked at it and said that the father every day was getting up and looking and seeing if his son was there, and finally he sees his son coming down this road, and he's just so happy to see him, and he runs to him. Okay. We don't really know which it is. We just know that the father sees him, the father runs to him. Now there are some, and I've been there, where people make a huge deal out of the fact that it says here that the man is running. Okay, that this man is running. And talking about how unseemly it would be in the Oriental, meaning Jewish context, for an elderly man like this to be running. Okay? I don't think there's anything unusual about this other than the fact that this guy is running. Okay, you think, oh, it's unusual to see. Now, this is a guy who's got two sons that are at least, I would guess, in their 20s or 30s. So that puts the father in his 40s or 50s, maybe older. Okay, so really, if you see any man in any environment running, it's unusual. Okay, certainly in this environment. I mean, I was thinking, my dad, my dad lived to be, I think, 79 years old. Just short of he died just short of his 80th birthday. And to the best of my knowledge, I only saw my dad actually run once in his life. Okay, and that was kind of a weird thing. We were kind of he and my mom had started signing up for these races, and he was actually walking on this particular race with my wife, and they came around a corner and they saw the finish line, and my dad just started chucking, and so it's like, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong here, but that's the only time I ever saw my dad run in his life. Okay, so and maybe if you start thinking about it, if you're a grown adult, how often do you see your father run? Okay, so again, it's just, that just shows that this guy is eager, the father is eager to see the son. He's eager to get to his son. Okay, let's not make any more. Let's not get lost in the details. Okay, but here the father runs to the son and grasps the son. Okay, and the son says to the verse 21, the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." And then the father cuts him off. The father doesn't let him finish. Okay? The father doesn't let him do the whole bit about make me one of your servants and I'll just be, he just says, he just hears that and that cuts him off. And he says, verse 22, but the father said to his servant, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found again." So they began to celebrate. Okay. Now, if we stopped right here, this story would be very, very similar, almost identical to the story of the lost coin and the lost sheep. Something was lost, slightly more complex reasons, but again, to the father, something was lost, and then something was found. Okay. Now, again, it's not through anything that the father did. That's the one difference. The father doesn't do anything to bring the son back, other than perhaps allowing the return visa, so to speak. I don't know. But to the father, it was lost. It's now found. Let's have a celebration. Now the father, because he has more means, he goes out and has a celebration. He says, kill the fatted calf, which is, an animal that they were serving, waiting for a big party. Hey, here's a party. This son, who I didn't think I'd ever see again, is back. Let's have a party. Okay? Now, if we left it right there, there'd be 3 stories. That'd be it. It'd be done with the stories. But there's more. Okay? Because, again, remember when we started the story, we said there's 2 brothers. Okay, it's the younger brother that had gone out and wasted the money and come back. Okay, so apparently we don't know what's happened to the brother in that meantime, but he's come back, and the father has welcomed him back. He's put family clothes on him. He's welcomed him back into the family. Okay, what about the other brother? Now I will tell you, I did once hear, well, let me put it this way. Whenever we talk about the older brother, it's always negative. Okay, we almost always talk about the older brother in a negative sense. Now, I do remember once hearing a sermon from preached by a pastor from Indiana named Jack Hyles. I grew up in the shadow of Jack Hyles in many ways. My pastor had grown up at the Jack Hyles Church, and Jack Hyles preached at our church, and we went to Hyles Church in Indiana. Jack Hyles had a great church, huge Sunday school. The whole, his ministry didn't end well, and certainly the legacy of his ministry hasn't ended well. But he, at the time he was a giant in the field, and I heard him preach a sermon once called "Let's Hear It for the Other Brother." So it's like the only time I've ever heard a sermon that explicitly and specifically praised the older brother. And it was talking about this older brother and duty, and he, Jack Hyles repeated the phrase, I dreamt and slept that life was beauty. I woke and found that life was duty. So much so, I was so impressed by it at the time that I literally wrote that in my Bible at the time. So if you pull out, it's one of my Schofield Bibles. I've got it. I dreamt and slept that life was beauty. I woke and found that life was duty. That Hyles had preached this particular sermon. Okay, but what about this older brother? Okay, but what about him? Meanwhile, verse 25, enter the older son. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. So the older son was out working where he was supposed to be, where the younger son was supposed to be working. Okay, but he wasn't. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Okay, now this is a key point. The older brother doesn't know what's going on. Okay, remember earlier we talked about the story about the man who had the banquet, and the people that couldn't come to the banquet, and the man throwing the banquet says, well, go, the halt, the lame, go out in the highways and the byways and compel them to come in, as the words of the song. So the man throwing that banquet had said, hey, make sure everybody knows about this banquet. Well, the father invited a bunch of people to this banquet, but he does not get the message to the older brother. So the older brother does not know about this banquet. He does not know what's going on. Okay? Now, would he have been felt differently if the younger brother had come to him first? Perhaps, I don't know. Again, this is a story. It's not true. So let's not get lost in the details here. But what we know is that the older brother doesn't know. He comes back and goes, hey, what's all the noise? And the servant tells him, a slave tells him, oh, well, your younger brother's back, and your father is throwing this huge party, and he's killed that special calf, okay, that special animal that was supposed to be for a big meal. And perhaps the older brother is thinking that fatted calf was going to be for, a funeral meat, a meal when his dad died and he took over. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, okay? But the brother is a little miffed, okay? the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So I am not going to have any part of this. Now here's the key. Now who's the main character of this story? The father. Okay. So his father went out and pleaded with him. Okay. This is kind of an interesting thought. The father goes out and pleads with him. Okay. The father doesn't have to. Even if in the end, and that is at his death, everything becomes his son's, at this point, it's still all his. He decides who comes to his party. He's the one in charge. It's his decision who he throws a party for. He doesn't have to explain himself to his son at all. He doesn't have to go out there. Okay? The father does not have to grant the younger son's wish to him. The father does not have to go out to the older son and explain what's going on, but he does. And he says, come into the party. I want you to be a part. Now, whether he, intentionally or not, we don't know, but we just know that the father, once the father realizes that the father that is not there, okay, he says, the older brother became angry and refused. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father. So he explains to his father. So the father explains to him, here's what happened. And the brother explains to him, he says, wait a minute here. Basically his point is, I've done everything right and you've given me nothing. That's the Stan version of this, okay? But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. Slaving for you. Okay, so again, remember I said that the younger brother looked at the father like a bank? Okay, more than a father, and I hear a kind of indication that the older brother kind of looks the same way. I'm just a slave to you. You're just a slaveholder to me. There's not a personal relationship. I've been doing all I need to do, and all this time, and you never gave me even a goat. Okay, now the question has to be asked: did he ever ask? Okay, again, this is fiction. I know we don't know, but again, did he ever ask? I don't know. All right. It says, yet you never gave me a boat. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Question: how does the older brother know that the younger son has squandered his property with prostitutes? Okay, we don't know. Is he speculating? Perhaps. Okay, maybe he's just making a wild guess. Maybe the servant told him. We don't know, but he's thrown it out there. But there again, remember we talked about is the younger son being foolish? Is he being sinful? Okay, the older brother certainly is leaning on the sinful side. Okay, that this is what he did with all the money. Now, and that may be true. That may be 100% true. What he did with all the money, we don't know that. Okay, probably is. I got to believe it is, but the text doesn't demand it. That's the point. That's the key point. The text doesn't demand it. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property, you come and kill the fatted calf. You didn't give me anything. I didn't get nothing, and he gets all this stuff. Okay, my son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. Okay, that's an interesting point. Okay. Now, when people talk about the restoration of the younger son, okay, people talk about the restoration of, oh yeah, he was restored to full sonhood. No, he's not. Okay, he doesn't have an inheritance. Okay, because the father tells the older son, everything I have is yours. I'm not dividing this up again. Everything I have is yours. You've got nothing to worry about here. Okay. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, the interesting thing here, comparing it to the first two, is that there's no explanation at the end. Remember at the end of the story of the parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost coin, there's an explanation. Yeah, there's rejoicing in heaven over a sinner who's repented. As over the sheep, there's as much rejoicing in heaven over a sinner who's repented as the lost coin. Now here you've got a sinner who's repented, okay, or somebody who certainly is in need of restoration, if you're going to lean on it, what are you going to do? The parable is left open. And I think this is one of the interesting things about this particular parable. He's talking to the Pharisees who are complaining about his relationship with sinners, and clearly that suggests that these sinners are being brought back into the kingdom. Okay? And are the Pharisees going to realize that these sinners being brought into the kingdom do not cost them anything? They are as much a part of the kingdom as they ever were or would have been with or without these sinners being brought in. Are they going to realize that and rejoice or not? Well, we don't know because it doesn't say. Okay? And I think the implication here, Jesus is throwing it out there, and the thing is to say, listen, you guys need to get on board. Okay? The father comes out and doesn't have to give the son his inheritance. The father doesn't have to come out and plead with the older brother. Okay? But the question is, are you going to rejoice over what's happening or not? Okay? And again, the question is left open. We don't have an answer here. So again, if somebody locks down an answer, they're bluffing. Okay? Now, from the most well-known story that Jesus tells, probably, certainly the most well-known parable, in Luke chapter 16, we're going to move into what is perhaps the strangest next time when we talk about the parable of the shrewd manager. So, thank you very much for being with me today. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking with you again next week. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, shoot me a text, Facebook message, however, comment in the YouTube, and we'll talk about this passage. Okay? See you next week when we talk about Luke chapter 16.